you've all traveled a lot. So I just want to just quickly tell me where has been your favorite or your most memorable or the trip that left you with the greatest impression, and where are you off to next?
Somebody else is going to have to answer this first. I need to think.
Happy to start. So I went to university in Austin, Texas, and there's just a special place in my heart for Austin. And I visited again after 10 years this past May, and it hasn't changed much, which is what I love about it. I would move back to Austin in a heartbeat. Okay. I actually tried to convince our British CEO that our U.S. office should be based in Austin, but that was a really hard sell for someone who wanted an office in London, New York, and Australia.
And where are you off to next?
I'm going to Italy over the summer.
Okay.
I'm going to start up in Liguria and kind of meander all the way down to Rome.
Peter, what about you? You've obviously traveled a lot. What has been your most memorable trip?
Well, I'm right with you. Madison, Wisconsin for me. Anybody here a Badger? All right. I mean, if you know Madison, Wisconsin, you know it's very much like Austin, state capital, surrounded by 4 lakes, beautiful place. I still have a great feeling for Madison. I owe my entire career to that college. And so I like that. But you asked about a special experience.
Yeah.
And I'll give you one, which comes usually when you're not expecting it. And most of you, even in your own vacation plans, will actually, if you're honest, will tell yourselves that the best experience you've ever had were when the plans didn't work. When you turned left and you should have turned right, and that's when you discovered something. I actually, in 1984, sailed into Shanghai. It was on the first ship to sail into Shanghai, really in a long time, that had passengers on it who were not Chinese, who were foreigners. And of course, the Chinese were very rigid in terms of what they wanted you to see in those days, and everybody had handlers. And I'm sort of contrarian about that. I don't really like to do that. And so I didn't go off on the organized tour. I waited till everybody else left, and I just walked off the ship. And I was by the dock, and a guy came up to me on a bicycle. He looked about 40 years old. I found out later he was 79. And in perfect English, he said, "Are you from the ship?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Hi, Joe Cheng." And I said, "Nice to meet you, Joe." I said, "You live here in Shanghai?" He says, "All my life." I said, "How'd you learn English?" He said, "It's a long story." I said, "Feel like telling me?" And he then got another bicycle and took me on a tour of Shanghai, which was the most amazing experience I've ever had, because he lived through the Cultural Revolution, where the fact that he spoke English meant that the Chinese moved him 50 miles outside of town because they thought he was a danger to the country. And an amazing, amazing story. He wanted to leave the country, but they wouldn't let him. He spoke English. He was then starting to teach English because it was now becoming an honorable profession to teach English. And I wrote a story about my day with Joe Cheng. A year later, and all he wanted to do was to move to New York, right? And the Chinese wouldn't give him a visa. And a year later, I came back to China looking for Joe Cheng, and I had his phone number. And I called, and nobody who answered the phone spoke English, because he was the only member of his family who did speak English. So I got the translator on the phone. I said, "Could you tell me where Joe Cheng is?" He says, "Oh yeah, he in Manhattan now."
And Peter, how did you translate that unexpected experience into a story? How do you take that story?
How could you not?
How do you craft a narrative out of that story? How did you do that?
The best way to see a city is with somebody who's lived through its entire history. And I mean, you remember the book Life and Death in the Nan Cheng book? I mean, that's what he was living, but it was just the male version. Mm-hmm. And with that, look who my tour guide was. A local. It was exactly what Sarah just said. And it turned into a great story, and he ended up moving to Manhattan permanently.
Okay. Sarah, first, where have you traveled? What was great, and where are you going next?
Okay. I won't list where I've traveled, but I will say probably one of my most formative trips was I spent a year studying abroad in England, and before I landed there, I spent about 2 months, I think, traveling around Europe by myself. And I'd been abroad sort of by myself, but never totally left to my own devices. And the way I planned my trip was I took my art history book, which was about like this thick, and I marked off all of the masterpieces I had always wanted to see, whether that was Sainte-Chapelle in Paris or David in Italy, and from that list, I then created my route, and that experience, which was both frightening at some points and liberating at others, was also incredibly enriching. And also, it really, when you take trips like that, it really builds your confidence, which I think is really important when when you're starting to make your way in the world. I'm leaving for Alabama tomorrow night.
Okay.
So, yeah, I spent my first job out of college was for a small newspaper in Alabama, which when I lived there, I absolutely hated. And I drove out of that town without a glance in my rearview mirror. And after I left, I missed it so much. So every couple of years, I go down to Alabama, to the middle of nowhere, and eat fried food and have a great time.
And will you write about this trip for the paper?
Part of this trip, yes, I'm going to write about.
Okay. And Alabama, obviously, and for many people, although I think Alabama sounds beautiful, for many people they would say, well, there's a whole world out there. Why Alabama? So I guess I'll ask all three of you, like, how do you determine where you're going to go? How do you determine which destinations are worthy right now of your attention?
Well, not to sound silly about it, I can't think of one that isn't. I mean, look, there are 196 countries in the world. And I've been to a lot of them. I have been to all of them. And I may never get to all of them.
Where have you not been that you're still itching to go?
The ones I haven't been to.
Okay.
I haven't been to about 45 of them. So I've been to about 151. But who's counting? But remember, some of them, just the logistics of getting there work against you getting there. If you want to go to Kiribati, the former Gilbert Islands, you got to take a month, because the boat only comes in every once in a while. But, every once in a while you get lucky, you go to Midway Island when you can actually do it, where you can get out in 3 days, because if you can't get out in 3 days, you are there a month, and I don't have that month. But the point is, most Americans, you were talking about being on your own. Most Americans are fearful travelers. Most Americans embrace fear as a way of making decisions when it comes to travel. They hear about a State Department advisory and go, I'm not going. How many people here have ever read a State Department advisory? Not? Okay. Well, you know what? The State Department advisory for Indonesia, if you read it, it says, Americans are warned to stay away from large crowds and avoid buses. I live in Los Angeles and I stay away from large crowds and I avoid buses. And I've never been on a bus in LA because I have no idea where they go. So the point is, if you can conquer your fear factor, then the answer to your question is the one I gave you. There's not a one that I wouldn't think is worthy. And when you think of, how about this? Think of all the states in this country that have a bad name, right? New Jersey gets a bad rap. New Jersey gets a bad rap, right? And we can keep going from there. Now, outside of the refineries on the Garden State Parkway, guess what? New Jersey's a beautiful state. And you just need to know that. The only places I wouldn't go are the places where no one's in control. And that's exceedingly few. Parts of Somalia, parts of the Congo, parts of Chechnya, and maybe Camden, New Jersey.
But there must be a method that you use for determining where you're going to go that week or the next week or the week after.
What determines that?
Yeah. In your
well, where the news is.
Where the news is.
And sometimes where the news isn't. For example, everybody's going to be hung up on the Olympics. Well, wait a second. What's going to happen before the Olympics or after the Olympics? What makes it a better time to go? Thinking always as a contrarian in that regard. Because first of all, that's what we mentioned seasonality. I'll put in a little plug. Next year, I'm doing another book, and the name of the book is called The Off Season. It's where to go when everybody tells you not to, because that's when you have the best experience. Now, you can talk about extremes. Why would you go to Alaska in the winter and Palm Springs in the summer? There are actually good reasons to do that.